In the early days of D&D, the big bad evil guy was just some boss that was waiting in the final room, sitting there, simply waiting for the adventurers to walk in so that you could have the final fight. This motif has gone on for years and years now, but the thing is more people want reoccurring villains. People want a villain that isn't simply just sitting around waiting. We want villains that are up in your players' faces. Now, while the idea of a recurring villain sounds great, there's a lot of questions we need to ask before we can actually have this happen. First off is, do they start off as villains? Of course, if you have the big bad evil guy just simply sitting there, this massive looming figure, then they are the villain right from the get-go. But what if they aren't the major villain right from the get-go? What if they are a minor villain, or maybe even a friend of the party? A great way to have an interpersonal relationship with the villain is to have the villain right there from the beginning, either as a protagonist, as an antagonist, or as a minor villain. Perhaps they could be one of the party's friends. Maybe they're that constable that gets on the party's nerves. Maybe they're the local thug that tries to hold up the party and then eventually stumbles across something far greater and expands his powers. Now, one of the important things about having a reoccurring villain is the conflict therein, where they clash, where they interact with one another. The question is, why is it that the villain doesn't kill the PCs? Is the villain using the PCs to some regard? Is the villain purposely antagonizing the party so that the party goes and clears something out for their own purposes? Maybe the villain isn't truly villainous enough yet and doesn't want to actually kill the party. Maybe the villain wants to capture the party. Whatever the case may be, you can't simply rely on the villain saying, "Oh, I just like beating you up," because that will get real old real quick. Your villain needs to have a believable motivation as to not kill the PCs if given the opportunity. Now, another important question is, does the villain scale with the party? Is the villain always going to be on par with the party, or is the villain just going to be this one set stat block for the entirety of the campaign and your party continuously goes up against them? If the villain is just a static stat block, then it is interesting because your party will eventually see their powers grow and eventually they will be able to tackle the big bad that they've been battling for so long. But another unique way of doing this is by having the villain be larger than life and the party eventually gets stronger and stronger, and also at the same time is using some sort of resource in the game to make the villain weaker and weaker. And eventually the villain all the way up here and the party down here, they eventually slowly meet, and that is when you have the epic final conclusion. Another way to go about it is have the villain always on par with the party. They both rise together in power, always going up against one another, antagonistic all the way through. Maybe the villain is just a little bit stronger than the party so that they're able to get away with what they are doing early on, but eventually they are going to come to blows and it's going to be a fair enough fight. Now, with a reoccurring villain, at some point your players want to beat them up. At some point your players want to finally get the upper hand. How are they finally beaten? And more importantly, why weren't they able to do this before? Is there a MacGuffin that your players have to find, and this one MacGuffin is the only way that your players are going to be able to succeed? Do your players need to lure the villain to a certain location? Is there a certain trick that the party learns about much later on in their adventures that is the trick to finally beating them? Is the villain going to give in to hubris and leave themselves open for the final blow? Is the villain going to be eventually ran into a corner with their back against the wall and they finally have nowhere left to run? While there needs to be a way for your reoccurring villain to constantly run away from the party, there needs to be a way for your party to finally catch up to them. And lastly here, how much is too much? How many times do you want the villain to interact with the party? If you're going to be running a 50-session campaign, does the villain get to fight the party 5 times? 10 times? Maybe even every other session? It really depends on the kind of relationship your party wants to have with this villain. Is it going to be a more slapstick in-your-face style approach? Or is this going to be sinister and evil, where every single time they meet the villain, they're filled with dread? Maybe you do want to have the classic rule of 3 approach, where your party fights them 2 times throughout the entirety of the campaign, and then the 3rd time is the final blow. This really comes down to the sort of villain that you have. If the villain is more characteristic and in your face, then for sure it can be a ton of fun. But if the villain is not that charismatic and they don't have that much of a characteristic for them, then I believe that too many approaches will be sort of boring. If the villain doesn't talk too much, if the villain always just says the one same thing, if the villain does the one same thing, then you can have a recurring villain, which is pretty boring. And not just the fact of their characteristic, but how much is too often for them to run away? Because it might get infuriating for some people to go up against someone that always seems to teleport away, or pulls the trap door, or is able to cast invisibility and run off. Having villains that run away can certainly get real old real quick. So there needs to be a give and take. The villain can't always just harass the party and then run away. That will get old. The villain needs to have their own wins. Beating up on the party members shouldn't be the only victory that the villains have. They need to be getting some sort of resource in the world. Maybe they have their own MacGuffins. Maybe they're luring the party to specific locations. Maybe they are testing the party to see if they're willing to join their cause. The villain needs to have goals and plans in motion that are more than just, I beat up on the party. Having a reoccurring villain in your campaign is a great way to have a memorable experience. And it's that much more sweeter if you've met the villain multiple times when you finally deliver that finishing blow. Whether they kill them, or if they capture them, or maybe even turn them from evil to good. There's a lot of different ways on how your players can approach trying to rectify the evil that this villain has done. So go ahead and tell me, are your reoccurring villains right from the get-go? Or maybe they have a much closer relationship to the party? Does your villain scale with the party, or are they big bad evils right from the get-go? And how is it that your party is finally going to deliver the finishing blow to the villain after so many encounters? Go ahead and tell me those things because I would love to hear it. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. And thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much. And I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.